In this video, I'm rigorously testing and comparing the top wireless probes on the market so you know the ones to buy and the ones to avoid. I'll be testing the Meter Plus, the Meter 2 Plus, the Yumli, ChefIQ, MeatStick, ChefsTemp, Typhur Sync, Combustion, and ThermoWorks TempSpike. And I'll be covering some controversial topics like, do you need multiple internal sensors in your wireless probe? Should these probes be designed for grilling? Why is Bluetooth range so terrible on most of these devices? And dearest to my heart, why is the ambient accuracy of all wireless probes so bad, and how are we being gaslighted into thinking that it's not? And in case that's not exciting enough, there's also going to be an explosion, so let's get smoking. Wireless probe thermometers are the best thing to happen to us home cooks since, well, wired thermometers. But unlike their wired cousins, you don't need to constantly fight with yards and yards of tangled wires on your journey to cooked meat perfection. You just plug them in and wirelessly monitor the temperature from the convenience of your phone, and they even send you obnoxiously loud alerts about when your meat is done, so you don't have to have any cooking skills at all. Just trust the probe. They're great and I love them, but there's so many on the market now that it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the choice. So to help you make a decision, I'm reviewing 9 of the most popular wireless probes, and I'm giving you my mostly unbiased opinion on which ones to buy. Now, I say mostly unbiased because Meter, ChefsTemp, and Typhur have all sent me probes for free to do sponsored videos in the past, not for this video, and some of the links in the description section below are affiliate links. That being said, this video is not sponsored or even influenced by any of the brands of thermometers that I am reviewing, and that will become very apparent as I talk about some of the bad points and some of the deep criticisms that I have of some of these probes from brands that have sponsored me in the past. This review took me hundreds of hours of testing, of script writing, of reviewing rigorously each probe against the other probe, and I've spent over $1,000 of my own money buying all of the other probes that weren't sent to me for free. As an example of how much work I put into this, I spent around 10 hours over several days just sitting by my offset smoker, manually logging ambient temperature readings and comparing them to the true ambient temperature reading from my ThermoWorks Signals wired probe, which was super tedious but necessary because most of these probes don't allow for data export, so I had to do it manually. And also the ambient temperature accuracy of all of these wired probes is super important to me. It's the most important issue because it's the #1 complaint that I get from all of my audience members about all wireless probes that they use. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of why all these wireless probe brands are saying on their website that their ambient probe is accurate to within a degree or two, but when I actually use it on my offset smoker, it's way off, like 20 to 30 degrees off, and that has been validated by a lot of my audience members that have wireless probes. I also spent even more time walking up and down my street testing the Bluetooth ranges on all of these 9 probes and really creeping out my neighbors. So I collected a ton of data on internal and ambient sensor accuracy, Bluetooth range, predictive cooking accuracy, customer support response time, and all of that data and methodology is in the description section below in a big Excel spreadsheet. If you are a super nerd or maybe one of these probe brands that I'm reviewing and you want to go over my experiments and my data, feel free to do that. Then I took all of that data, all of those numbers, and I ranked all of the probes according to a marking rubric. The problem is that super quantitative way of going about ranking all these probes was very misleading because I'd get a probe that looked really great on paper, it did everything perfectly, but the ambient accuracy was the worst of all the probes that I had reviewed, so therefore it can't be first place because I can't even use and recommend that probe. So I did use all of the quantitative data in informing my opinion, but a lot of it is subjective, it's my own opinion, and it's based on how I cook, which is low and slow cooking on an offset smoker or a pellet grill or a Kamado smoker or a WSM, or maybe even in my oven once in a while, but I don't use these wireless probes for direct heat searing and grilling that often. I just use an instant read thermometer for that, so keep that in mind, but I also did some direct heat grilling experiments in this video to test out that functionality. Also, as a proud Canadian who is bound by the Maple Syrup Convention of 1923 to be polite at all times, I'm not going to rank these probes with cold and passionate numbers that could make some of these brands feel bad. I'm instead going to use the Canadian ranking scale. But having said that, at the end of this video, I will be giving you my top picks. Kicking things off, we have the Yumli Smart Thermometer by KitchenAid. Now, the probes in this video are in no particular order, like I just said, but this is the exception because I had such a terrible experience with it that I feel really comfortable ranking this in last place, not recommending it to you, and this is why. The Yumli has 2 internal temperature sensors to measure the temperature of the meat meat it is inserted into. That's so you can have a better chance of getting a reading on the coldest part of the meat. I tested the internal accuracy in an ice bath, boiling water, and in a steak cooked to 130 degrees. No issues, so that's a very positive point. But the ambient temperature sensor is not accurate in any type of cooking device with any type of airflow or temperature swings. Now, this is a problem with all wireless probe thermometers, and I'll get into it in depth later in this video, but in short, it's because there's a ton of insulation around the ambient sensor, which means it's slow to respond to temperature change. And also this probe has to be fully inserted into the meat, which means it's very close to the cold meat, which results in heat piping from the tip of the ambient sensor down to the cold meat, and that causes the temperature to skew low. Now, I tested it in a sous vide steam box holding a laser steady 156 degree temperature, and the ambient sensor consistently read exactly 156, so it was spot on. This is how these probe brands can tell us that their ambient sensors are accurate. They put them in laser steady cooking environments, so they allow their ambient sensor to fully warm up, come to equilibrium with the surrounding environment, and then they note that the temperature difference is less than 1 degree, and then they say our ambient sensors are accurate within less than 1 degree. And if you complain to one of these probe companies about the ambient accuracy, then they may ask you to do what's called a boiling water test, where you boil water, you put the probe in, and then you note what the temperature of the water is, which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. And if your ambient sensor is 212 degrees, then they say, hey, there's no problem with your ambient sensor, it's bang on accurate. But that's complete BS, because my sous vide cooking chamber and a laser steady temperature environment and boiling water does not reflect an actual real life cooking situation. In real life, your oven is swinging up and down by plus or minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and if you're using an offset smoker like I do, then you could be getting temperature swings of anywhere from 25 to 50 degrees at any given time. So what I found is that the Yummly ambient sensor was about 40 degrees off on average from my offset smoker true ambient temperature, making this the probe with the worst ambient accuracy in my tests. Now, I reached out to Yummly customer support about this issue, and here's where the gaslighting begins. And I use the term gaslighting because in a lot of the interactions I had with these probe brands and their customer support staff, they tried to convince me that it was my fault that the ambient sensor reading was off. It couldn't possibly be a problem with their product. In this case, Yummly said, in part, your readings may also differ from the readings on your oven or grill, as those readings are either an average of the appliance or a specific location within the appliance. The smart thermometer shows you the temperature directly around your meat. This is a pretty typical canned response. They'll say that your reference thermometer is too far away from the tip of the ambient sensor and that temperatures can fluctuate in different areas of your cooking device, or your reference thermometer is just inaccurate. And that can be true in some cases. It's not in this case, because in all of my tests, my reference thermometer was right next to the ambient sensor. And as long as the reference thermometer is right next to the ambient sensor, I can tell you right now, it is not your fault that the ambient sensor is off. It is a problem with the product itself. Namely, there's too much insulation around the ambient sensor and it's too close to a huge chunk of cold meat. And maybe problem is too strong a word, because it's not really a problem. It's a feature of the actual product. It was designed for high temperature grilling, so they had to protect the ambient sensor with a bunch of ceramic insulation, and as a result, it's not very temperature responsive. Or they designed the probe too short so that you have to insert it all the way into the meat, and you have to put that ambient sensor way too close to the cold meat so you get a ton of heat piping. What they arguably should do is make the probe a lot longer and put the ambient sensor way on the end so it's not close to that cold chunk of meat. Basically, they need to redesign the product. The wireless connection is also an issue. The Yummly has Bluetooth technology to connect to the app on your phone, and it claims to have 150 feet of wireless range. Now, it may have 150 feet of wireless range in open air with no obstructions, but in real life, we have all sorts of obstructions between us and the probe, so that limits the range a lot. In my case, the booster needs to send a signal from my smoker in my backyard through an exterior wall, and to me 35 feet away as I sit on my couch. And with just those light obstacles and short distance, I get dropped connections all the time with my Yummly just 35 feet away, so I find I only get reliably 15 feet of range out of this thing, which makes it completely useless to me. Now, to be fair, this is an issue with all wireless probes. Because wireless probes and their boosters are so tiny, they also have a tiny battery, and that limits their transmission power when you compare it to something like, let's say, your home Wi-Fi, which is plugged directly into the wall. Bluetooth technology is really well suited to something like a wireless mouse or wireless headphones, because the receiver and the transmitter are within a foot of each other in most cases, but with a wireless probe, it's often in your backyard and the signal has to travel through several walls and maybe up to 100 feet away to get to you in your house, which is asking a lot for the tiny transmitting power in these devices. So I think wireless probes need some degree of Bluetooth technology for the probe to send a signal to the booster, which is typically less than a foot away. But in my opinion, it shouldn't be the only option to connect your phone to the booster, because in most cases you are really far away from the booster and the Bluetooth range struggles. And even the wireless probes with the best Bluetooth range often struggle if there's lots of obstacles between you and the booster or you're really far away. And even if the Bluetooth range is exceptional, you still can't leave the house and go walk your dog because you'll lose connection. And you definitely can't go to the grocery store or the convenience store because you'll definitely lose connection as soon as you leave your house. So I think all wireless probes should come standard with a Wi-Fi connection. It gives you unlimited connection anywhere you are in the world. You can always monitor your temperature from your phone, and you don't have to worry about drop signals from the probe to your phone. But in this case, the Yummly only has Bluetooth, it doesn't have Wi-Fi, and to make matters worse, it has the worst Bluetooth range of any probe that I tested. Like all other probes I tested in this video, the Yummly also has predictive cooking. That means it'll give you an estimate of when your meat will hit the targeted temperature. I cooked a steak in my holding oven at 270 degrees, and it took 20 minutes for the steak to hit my desired finishing temperature of 130 degrees. It did give me an accurate estimate when the steak was 5 minutes away from hitting 130, which I could have estimated with my own brain, but it didn't give me an estimate for the first 15 minutes, it just said it was working on an estimate. So the cook was almost over by the time the Yummly gave me an estimate, and it also didn't account for carryover cooking. It just gave me an alert when the steak hit exactly 130 degrees, and as a result, it carried over by 3 to 5 degrees, and in my opinion, overcooked my steak. So it's not a big deal on a thin cut of meat, but if you're cooking something like a prime rib, then you'll manually have to set the temperature to a couple degrees lower than what your set temperature is, and in the case of a prime rib, up to 10 to 15 degrees lower because it carries over a lot. So carryover cooking is a very hard thing for me to estimate in my own mind, so it would be nice if these smart thermometers could actually predict how much the meat is going to carry over. I think that would be a big value add, but unfortunately, the Yummly does not do that. To test out Yummly's customer support, I emailed their customer support about my ambient accuracy issues with the Yummly. They took 3 business days to respond, which is really good for customer support, but I mention it because most of the other probe brands that I contacted got back to me within less than a day or within 1 business day. I then emailed them again with another issue a couple weeks later because my Yummly just stopped connecting altogether. I had to uninstall the app and then reinstall it to get a connection, and then it just stopped connecting at all. So I wasn't able to get as much data on the Yummly as I was with other thermometers. And as a result, a lot of the quantitative data that I collected is just anecdotal before I actually started sitting down and recording data of all of these probes. Now, Yummly did offer to replace the probe for me. I said, yes, please send me a replacement, but I still have not heard back from them. To be fair to Yummly, if I do hear back from them and they do send me a new probe, then I will mention that in the description section below. Moving on to the app, it's fairly straightforward to use. It shows the internal and ambient sensor readings and graphs out the temperature data. It saves the graph so you can review previous cooks, and it lets you share a picture of the graph, but unfortunately it doesn't let you export data, which I think should be a standard feature for all wireless probes. The app experience was also a little bit frustrating when I got too far from the Yummly charger booster and I dropped connection. I found that I had to go all the way back to the Yummly booster and put my phone really close to it to reestablish the connection, and in some cases it just wouldn't reestablish the connection, and I had to put the Yummly back in the charger and then take it out, and sometimes I even had to install the whole app and reinstall it, so it had really spotty connection issues. The Yummly app also has a ton of recipes, a meal planner, and a shopping list, so it's a very robust app if you're new to cooking and you want everything cooking related in one place. I took a spin through all the recipes and I found such bangers as man-pleasing chicken, which sounds pretty sexy. Personally, I find it kind of frustrating when these wireless probe brands really push the recipe content and bury the actual functionality of the thermometer in the back of the app. If I wanted a recipe, I would just go on the internet and find a recipe for something that I wanted to make. I just don't find the recipe content on all of these wireless probe apps very helpful. And this is just my personal opinion. A lot of people might find the recipe content very useful, but I just want my wireless probe thermometer to do a really good job at what it's supposed to do, which is being a thermometer. Focus on telling me the actual accurate temperature and connecting to my phone, and then focus on adding all of those extra features, because no amount of these extra features are going to make up for the fact that the ambient sensor is inaccurate for any of these wireless probes. It's kind of like how I want my watch to tell me the correct time. I want my wireless probe thermometer to tell me the correct temperature. A few other things to mention: the battery life is pretty good on the Yummly thermometer. motor. That's a positive note. It lasted for a 12-hour brisket cook that I did, and I left it out of the charger overnight and it still had a charge in the morning, so it easily lasted 24 hours. On the negative side, in addition to the points that I already mentioned, the probe is really thick, so it's going to leave a bigger hole in your meat compared to other wireless probes that are much thinner. It's not dishwasher safe, and it can't be submerged into water, which again, a lot of other probes can be submerged in water. And because the internal sensors are so sensitive, you have to insert the probe all the way into the meat, otherwise they're going to overheat. And as a result, you get a lot of heat piping because the ambient sensor is so close to the meat, and that affects the ambient temperature accuracy. It also gives you less flexibility with depth of insertion because you have to insert your probe all the way into the meat. And if you have a small piece of meat, then the probe could go all the way through it before you actually get to the area that you want to measure. And you don't really have any flexibility to pull it out a little bit and have some standoff distance there like you do with other probes. Overall, the Yummly probe works and it gets the job done, albeit with limited range and an ambient temperature sensor that doesn't respond to temperature change very well at all. The predictive cooking works and the internal temperature sensor is accurate, and I recently saw it on sale for $76, so it's pretty inexpensive, but that depends on sales at any given time. And for a Bluetooth only probe, I think the ThermoWorks TempSpike is superior to this one. So if you're looking for a budget Bluetooth only probe, then I would look at my ThermoWorks TempSpike review later in this video. Overall, the Yummly works and it's inexpensive, but KitchenAid really needs to make some improvements to keep this product competitive, namely a better connection and better ambient sensor accuracy. So on the official Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the Yummly a Shania Twain because that don't impress me much. Next up, in no particular order, is the TempSpike by ThermoPro. It has one internal and ambient probe, it's waterproof, and it claims to have 500 feet of wireless Bluetooth range. I'll be honest with you guys, because I'm a little bit biased, I wanted to hate this probe because I've had bad experiences with ThermoPro products in the past, but the TempSpike really changed my mind, and to be honest, if it had a Wi-Fi connection and not just Bluetooth, it would probably be one of, if not the best probe that I reviewed in this video. But unfortunately, it's Bluetooth only at the moment. Let's talk about Bluetooth range, because like the Yummly, the TempSpike only has Bluetooth. It doesn't have Wi-Fi, so it better have good Bluetooth range. In my open air test, I found that the TempSpike had 632 feet of open air wireless range, which is better than most other probes that I tested. And in my obstacle test, I found that I could get a connection to the TempSpike anywhere in my house, which makes it a usable product for me. I did another test where I tested the open air range from the probe to the actual booster, and that was 350 feet, which is very impressive because it's better than both the Yummly and both of the meters that I tested in this video as well. That open air test from the probe to the booster is kind of a rough approximation of how good the signal is going to be from the probe to the booster when it's separated by something like a thick oven door or a thick steel lid of a smoker. The longer that open air range is, the better connection it's going to have through an obstacle. And this one is really good. I never had any issues even when the probe was in my Yoder trailer smoker, which is 1/4 inch thick steel, and this booster was about a foot away. I would easily get a drop connection with a lot of the other probes that I tested in this video with that circumstance. So it's good, but unfortunately I couldn't get a connection when I was 85 feet away sitting in my basement, all the way to the back of my property behind my garage where my Yoder trailer smoker is. The Bluetooth range didn't go that far, so I really wish this had Wi-Fi because then I would never have a connection issue. The internal temperature is pretty accurate. It was off a little bit in my ice bath test, but in my boiling water test, it was bang on. And when I tested it in a 130-degree steak, it was also bang on. So I'm pretty confident with the internal sensor accuracy. The ambient sensor accuracy initially had me a little bit concerned because it was off in both my boiling water and ice bath tests, but in my temperature steady sous vide holding device at 156 degrees Fahrenheit, it was 100% accurate within a degree. And most impressively, it was only 7 degrees off on average in my offset smoker, which makes this the probe with the most accurate and responsive ambient sensor of any of the probes that I tested in this video. I also tested it in my pellet grill while smoking some short ribs using Smokin' Pecan pellets, which is the sponsor for this video. Thank you, Smokin' Pecan, for sending me these pellets to use in this video. These pellets by far produce the best smoke flavor of any pellets I've used on a pellet grill. I'm not entirely sure why, but my running theory is that it's because pecan shells are very high in lignin content, which produces a lot of smoke flavor. Mesquite wood, for example, also contains a lot of lignin, and it is very well known for producing very smoky flavors. But whatever the reason is, Smokin' Pecan pellets produce really good smoke flavor, better than any other pellet I've used on a pellet grill, whereas with other brands of pellets that I've used, I barely get any smoke flavor at all. So I really like them, and they also sell just raw pecan shells, which I just throw into the smoke box on my Woodwind Pro to produce even more smoke flavor. The short ribs I smoked for this test turned out really juicy, and the smoke flavor was amazing from the smoke and pecan pellets. The best way I could describe the flavor is smoky, bacony, and it's got some hints of licorice and clove. It's got a ton of depth and it really adds a nice flavor. You can get smoke and pecan pellets using the link in the description section below, and I highly recommend you try them and consider trying their shells as well, because they can be burned in an offset or a charcoal or other type of smoker, as well as a pellet grill with a smoke box or a smoke cage. Again, click the link in the description section below to pick up some smoke and pecan pellets. They're really good. I highly recommend them and you won't be disappointed. Now, while I was cooking the short ribs in the pellet grill test, the TempSpike was within 2 degrees of the true ambient temperature measured by my ThermoWorks signals. So basically it was dead on accurate, and this leads me to believe that if you were cooking in something with super stable temperatures like a Kamado style smoker, you'd probably get accuracy with this to within a degree. It's honestly the only probe that I reviewed in this video of all 9 probes that I'd actually rely on for an accurate ambient temperature reading. But why is it so much better at measuring ambient temperature than the other probes I reviewed in this video? Well, I think it's in the design of the ambient sensor casing. You can see how it's very thin and it has way less insulation around it than other probes like the MeatStick or the Yumly, or an extreme example is the ChefsTemp. Look at the difference in how much material surrounds the sensor. You can also pull the ambient sensor quite far out from the meat without the app complaining that the internal sensors are going to overheat. So that allows you to get a lot of standoff distance from the cold meat to prevent heat piping, and also get away from the evaporative boundary layer of steam that's coming off the meat and cooling the surrounding area. Whatever the reason, this TP970 model is extremely accurate, and even with the thinner insulation around the ambient sensor, I was still able to sear a steak without it overheating. Now, I did contact ThermoPro because I noticed that in their dual TempSpike product, it looked like the ambient probes had a thicker, newer style head. And in some of the pictures of the single TempSpike, it looks like they've switched to that head as well, which has me concerned because I think that extra insulation might make this probe less accurate. And if the newer model's ambient sensor isn't as accurate as this particular model, then that would completely change my review. I probably wouldn't recommend this probe. So for the purposes of this review, keep in mind I'm reviewing the TP970 model with the thinner ambient sensor head, and in my tests I found this model had a particularly accurate ambient sensor, and that's why I'm recommending it. Moving on over to predictive cooking. For the predictive cooking test, I cooked a steak for 33 minutes to 130 degrees Fahrenheit internal, and I noted down the cook time estimate every 5 minutes. Then I calculated how far off each recording was from the actual time it took to reach 130 degrees, and then I took an average of how far each estimate was off, which I call the delta or the difference. On average, the estimate was off by about 7 minutes, which makes the predictive cooking of the TempSpike the worst of all of the probes that I tested, but take that with a grain of salt because I only did one test. It's a very low sample size. All I was doing is just making sure that the predictive cooking feature actually works, and for this product it does. If I really wanted to do an in-depth test, I'd probably use different thicknesses of meat in different cooking situations, but for this test I just tested all the probes in a similar size cut of steak, and I cooked them for 30 to 40 minutes, but it's not enough data to draw definitive conclusions. Now, even though my ambient sensor was only off by 7 degrees on average in my offset smoker, I still wanted to test out ThermoPro's customer support, so I complained about their sensor being off by 7 degrees, and they actually didn't gaslight me. They gave me some honest info. They said, when inserting the probe into cold or very cold food, it causes the stainless steel probe to become cold, which also causes the ambient sensor to read cooler than it actually is, since it's located within the stainless steel probe / ceramic handle. It will eventually read accurately as the probe begins to warm, but it will take longer for it to become accurate. They're talking about heat piping, which I've talked about before in this video, and I'll talk about some more later, but they're being honest. They're talking about an actual issue that this product and all other wireless probes have, so good on them for being honest and not just blaming it on the consumer or trying to hide it. The app is pretty basic in design, but it's easy and quick to get all the information you need. The internal and ambient reading is displayed on one screen, and you can set alarms and disable notifications quite easily. That feature is more important than you think. It's really annoying when it's the middle of the night and your alarms start going off and you have no idea how to disable all the notifications that these wireless probes have, so having that disable button right up front is really handy. One negative thing I would say is I don't like how you have to press the record button to start recording temperature data. I wish that it was just automatic. But on the plus side, this app does let you both view, save, and export raw temperature graph data via CSV. Most other probes don't do that, so kudos to ThermoPro for doing that. I think it should just be a standard feature on all wireless probes. Some other things to mention: the probe isn't the thinnest of all the probes that I tested, but it's still pretty good. It's a lot thinner than a lot of other probes that I tested. Battery life is more than enough for a long brisket cook. It has a rechargeable battery, which is nice because you can just plug it in. You don't have to replace the batteries. It's IP67 waterproof, so you can put it in your dishwasher. Although that's next to useless, you really need to scrub these things with steel wool or a scrubby pad, especially if you use them in a smoker. And because it's fully waterproof, I wouldn't be surprised if you could use it fully encased in a sous vide bag, fully submerged in water. Haven't tried it yet, but I think it might work. I did boil it in water and it was still working fine after I used it, so it does seem to be waterproof. Also, this could be a major negative if you intend to do a lot of grilling with your wireless probe. I tested the max ambient temperature over a gas burner and measured how long it took before I got an overheat warning on the app. For reference, I tested the Meter 2 Plus and it took a full minute before I got an overheat warning, but with the TempSpike, I got an overheat warning in just 12 seconds, making this probe the worst wireless probe for direct heat grilling. That being said, I did grill a steak with it and it didn't overheat, so when it's plugged into a cold piece of meat, it may be able to get the job done, and I don't really use a wireless probe for grilling a lot anyway. I just prefer to use an instant read thermometer. So it could be an issue for you if you want to do a lot of grilling, but for me personally, the way that I cook is mainly low and slow cooking on a smoker, and I'd rather have lower grilling performance with less ceramic insulation around the ambient probe if it means that the ambient sensor is more accurate, because I want that ambient sensor accuracy. I don't care as much about grilling. Currently on sale for $79.99 at the time I edited this video. It is tied with the Yummly for the most budget-friendly wireless probe, but unlike the Yummly, I would actually recommend this one. And to be clear, I'm only recommending the TP970 model with the thinner ambient probe head. I'm not recommending the other models because I haven't tested them yet. The TempSpike is very accurate. It has the best ambient accuracy of all of the probes I tested. It allows for raw data export. It has good Bluetooth range, and I'd be willing to call this probe the best on the market if only it had a Wi-Fi connection. Biggest downside is it doesn't have Wi-Fi, and it's not that great at grilling, but I don't really care about that as long as it has good ambient sensor accuracy. So hopefully ThermoPro adds Wi-Fi connection in the future, and hopefully they don't screw up the ambient sensor accuracy with their new model of probe head. On the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the TempSpike a Hayden Christensen because it's very powerful, but it can't withstand high temperatures. Moving on to the MeatStick. I like the name, and this brand has an enormous array of different products. Someone on my channel asked me to review it, so I was like, okay, I'll pick up a MeatStick. Oh my god, there's like 6 or 7 meat sticks to choose from, so it's kind of difficult, but in the end I chose what I felt was the latest model offering all of their best features, which is the MeatStick 4X. The 4X has 1 ambient sensor and 3 internal sensors. That's 1 more than the Yummly and 2 more than the TempSpike, so in the world of disposable razor marketing, it's better. It also claims to have up to 650 feet of range with the built-in booster. Let's talk about that because although the MeatStick has an optional Wi-Fi product you can buy for additional money, it relies solely on Bluetooth, so it better have good Bluetooth range. And it really does. In my open air range test, I was able to get a connection up to a staggering 1,100 feet away in open air, which is a lot further than the advertised 650 feet. And it's much better by far than any other probe I tested in this video. It was also the only probe that I tested where I could get Bluetooth connection all the way from my Yoder trailer smoker at the back of my house behind my garage, through all the walls in my garage, through a concrete retaining wall, and all the way to me at the back of my basement, 85 feet away, which is super impressive. I also got 450 feet of range from the probe to the booster, which would tell me that this should have good connectivity through something like a heavy smoker lid, but I found that I did get drop connections and I had to have the booster quite close to the probe, which was in the smoker, in order to establish a connection between the probe and the booster. But as soon as I got a stable connection between the probe and the booster, the Bluetooth range was phenomenal. So while the MeatStick doesn't come standard with Wi-Fi, you get a ton of Bluetooth range, so you might not need Wi-Fi at all. And if you decide you still want Wi-Fi, they have an extra product that you can buy for I think around $65, which will give you Wi-Fi. Moving on to temperature accuracy, the MeatStick was bang on accurate in a boiling water test, an ice bath test, and in a real life test cooking mistake. Now, the ambient sensor was 1 degree off in the ice bath test, but I think that's just because the minimum temperature only goes down to 34 degrees, and the ice bath was probably around 33 degrees, so it just couldn't get down to that temperature. But in the boiling water test, it had no issues and it was bang on accurate. So the ambient sensor is accurate under stable temperature conditions, but unfortunately it's pretty far off when you're using something like an offset smoker. In my case, I was rolling temperatures from around 250 to 310 degrees in my offset smoker, and this was about 21 degrees off on average, which makes it kind of unreliable for me and means that I can't really use it on my offset smoker. It also makes it one of the worst probes for ambient temperature accuracy of the probes that I tested, and I think it's due to a couple reasons. Yes, there's a lot of insulation around the ambient probe, which I think affects the temperature accuracy, but I think the biggest issue that I got bad accuracy readings on this is that you have to insert the probe all the way into the meat. I found that if I just pulled it out just a little, it still gave me internal overheat warnings and told me to push it all the way in because those internal sensors were so sensitive. So in their next iteration of this product, if MeatStick could improve that resilience and allow you to pull the thermometer out a little bit from the meat to get a little bit more standoff distance between the ambient probe and the cold meat, I think that would help the ambient accuracy issues quite a bit. On that note, let's take a break from the MeatStick review for a little bit and talk about ambient sensor issues, because a lot of people with wireless probes complain about this issue. As I've said in this video, most wireless probes record accurate ambient temperatures when the cooking temperature is very stable, but they really struggle to give an accurate reading when there's any type of temperature fluctuations in the cooking device. For example, let's say an offset smoker. This is because of a few reasons. The first one is heat piping. Let's use this screwdriver as an example. When you insert the internal sensor into cold meat, what happens is you get a lot of heat hitting the ambient sensor, but it's quickly wicked away and piped down into the colder side of the probe. And that means that the ambient temperature sensor tends to skew lower than the actual true ambient temperature. To illustrate this concept, I coated a wireless probe in thermochromatic pigment, which changes color when it heats up. And then I turned on a space heater and recorded how fast the color changed from blue to purplish pink. After the control test, I inserted the probe into a cold apple to simulate a cold piece of meat. Then I turned on the space heater. You can see how the probe inserted into the cold apple changes color less quickly. That's because the cold temperature of the apple is sucking away heat from the head of the probe. That's in part why the ambient sensors on all of these remote probes tends to skew low, and the more you insert the probe, the worse the problem is, because the ambient sensor is closer to the cold meat, or the apple in this case. I had to use an apple because budget cuts. Second, there's a colder boundary layer of evaporating moisture surrounding meat when you cook it. It kind of gets blown away in high airflow environments like a convection oven, and definitely in an offset smoker where you have a ton of airflow. But in general, if that evaporative boundary layer is in place and the probe is inserted really close to the meat within that boundary layer, then the ambient sensor is reading the temperature in that boundary layer, and that tends to be really low because all of that evaporating moisture is dropping the temperature below the true ambient temperature outside of that boundary layer. That's the theory anyway, and it's what some probe brands will tell you as one of the reasons why their ambient temperatures aren't 100% accurate. I've never tested it, but I probably will one day. Third, at least one probe that I know of for sure, and maybe more, use an algorithm to adjust the ambient temperature because they know that the ambient temperature reading of their probe isn't the true ambient temperature because of the insulation and heat piping and other issues. So they use the algorithm to translate that reading into something that they think is closer to the true ambient temperature reading, and because algorithms aren't reality, it's often a little bit off. And fourth, and in my opinion most importantly, remote probe thermometers have a ton of insulation around the ambient probe thermometer, similar to the handle on this screwdriver. And all that extra insulation and girth means that the ambient sensor is much slower to respond to temperature changes than something like a wired thermometer where the thermocouple is just encased by a really thin piece of metal like this. It's similar to how when you wear a jacket on a cold winter day, you don't immediately feel the outside temperature because that jacket is insulating you, whereas if you took the jacket off, you would immediately get extremely cold. And it's why everyone in the barbecue world complains about the ambient sensor accuracy of these wireless probe thermometers. It's not that they're intrinsically inaccurate, they're accurate in a very temperature stable cooking environment, but as soon as you introduce any sort of temp swings, the insulation around the ambient probe prevents it from responding very quickly, so what you're really getting is what the temperature was maybe 2 or 3 minutes ago, which obviously is inaccurate because the temperature has changed. To illustrate this concept, I coated a wired thermometer probe in thermochromatic pigment, put it next to a wireless probe, and I turned a space heater on. You can see how the wired probe changes color super quickly compared to the slower reaction of the wireless probe. That's because the wired probe has a thinner sensor tip, and it's partly also because it's fully made of metal, which is more conductive than the ceramic insulation around the ambient sensor of the wireless probe. There's also a couple other reasons why wireless probe thermometers are a little bit off from, let's say, something like a wired probe thermometer that's a few inches away from the meat. A big one I learned from the CEO of Combustion Inc., Chris Young, is that wired probe thermometers can actually skew a little bit higher because the metal wires pick up heat from the surrounding cooking environment, let's say your grill grates or just the convective currents in your oven, and they pipe that heat into the tip of the probe, which means that wired thermometers tend to skew a little bit higher than the true ambient temperature. I personally think that it only accounts for wired probe thermometers skewing maybe a few degrees higher than true ambient, but more on that when we talk about the combustion probe. Also, you could see a difference in temperature between your wireless probe ambient sensor and something like a wired thermometer or the dome thermometer on your smoker or your oven thermometer because they're simply in just different areas of your cooking device. The ambient probe sensor is right next to the meat, maybe in the middle of your oven. Well, the probe that takes the temperature that controls the oven might be in the back or the top of the oven. And even a couple millimeters of difference in probe location can make a pretty big difference depending on the cooking environment. Now, you can get better ambient accuracy readings in a few ways. You can simply pull the ambient sensor further from the meat, and that will remove the ambient sensor further and give more standoff distance from the cold boundary layer of evaporating moisture around the meat and the fact that the meat is super cold and all of that heat piping is occurring. But with some probes like the Yummly or the MeatStick, the internal sensors are very sensitive, so you have to insert it all the way, which means you have to get it really close to that cold meat and that boundary layer, which makes the ambient sensor inaccurate. You can also try to maintain steadier cooking temperatures. The steadier the temperatures, the better and more accurate readings you'll get from your ambient sensor on your wireless probe. The problem is with an offset smoker, temperature swings are just a reality of life. It's not unusual for me, someone who's been smoking for a really long time on offset smokers, still I get temperature swings anywhere from 25 to 50 degrees when I'm cooking. And you could pay more attention and dial it in a lot more than that, but for me, I'm running out every 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so in between my workday, in between doing other stuff, and that's just how I run my offset smokers, and it's just a reality of life for most people that are using a smoker. So when talking about temperature accuracy, I think a lot of wireless probe brands get away with saying that their probe is super accurate because they're testing their ambient sensor in a lab-controlled environment with super stable temperatures. Everything is allowed to get up to equilibrium and there's no temperature fluctuations. And yeah, the ambient sensor is going to be accurate to within a degree in most cases. But in real life, every cooking device has some sort of temperature swings, including regular ovens and definitely pellet smokers and offset smokers. They all go up and down over time. And the fact that wireless probes suffer from all these issues, which lowers the temperature responsiveness, it gives you an inaccurate temperature at any given time. So it's kind of a pet peeve for me when wireless probe brands put on their website that their ambient sensors are super accurate to within less than a degree. It's not really honest, in my opinion, for all types of cooking situations, and I think that's why a lot of people get angry in the barbecue world. They rely upon those representations in websites and marketing material that the ambient sensor is going to be super accurate, and then they put it in their offset smoker and they get these wildly inaccurate results. And then is it any wonder that they're complaining to the brand that their ambient sensor is inaccurate? And then to make matters worse, with some of these probe brands, they kind of gaslight the customer and tell them, no, it's not our fault that your ambient sensor is off. It's because you're measuring it in the wrong place in the cooker or some other reason that isn't their fault. And that kind of annoys me because they're not owning up to the inherent problems that wireless probe ambient sensors have and saying, hey, yeah, this is a problem, but we're working on it. I'd really like to see more probe brands do that. And arguably, they should be saying that up front in their marketing materials and their website. Yes, it's accurate to with 1 degree, but asterisks, it's off by 30 degrees in an offset smoker on average. Something that gives the consumer a little bit better of an idea of what their actual experience is going to be. Okay, back to the MeatStick review. I reached out to MeatStick customer support about the ambient accuracy issues I was having with their product, and they got back to me the next day, which is a really good sign. They said I could be having issues because of hot and cold spots in the smoker, the evaporative bubble effect, which is basically the vapor barrier effect that I talked about earlier in this video, and temperature fluctuations, which are all standard reasons that a lot of probe brands give me when I complain about their their ambient sensor accuracy issues, but they did correctly identify temperature swings as being a main cause, which I really like. And I wish more probe brands would just straight up say that. Hey, are you having temperature swings? That's probably the reason why your ambient sensor isn't accurate. As for predictive cooking, I did a quick 15-minute cook and it gave me an accurate estimate at all stages of the cook. It also accounted for carryover and it warned me to take it off early, which is a great feature. Really love that, and I think all probes should have that feature. At first I thought the app looked a bit antiquated and I was worried about what I was in for, but after using it for a while I came to appreciate its simplicity and layout. Pairing a probe is quick and easy with guided tutorials, and all of the information is nicely laid out and intuitive to find. This seems like a small thing, but with a lot of other probes that I tested, I found I had to dig for where the temperature graph was or where to find the multiple internal sensor readings, and with a MeatStick, it's all laid out right in front of you. Another great feature the MeatStick has is the ability to export your temperature data, which I think that all wireless probes should have. I don't know why everyone doesn't offer that. It's a big deal for barbecue nerds like me. As for other good points, the MeatStick 4X has 3 internal sensors, which is helpful for getting an idea of the temperature gradients in your meat and ensuring you're always measuring the lowest temperature. There's also multiple different lengths of probes you can choose from in the MeatStick ecosystem, and you can also upgrade with their Wi-Fi extender if you want unlimited range. For other negative points, it's somewhat annoying how on the booster I have to click this little button to turn it on. If that button's not on, then the booster won't work, and sometimes I just forget to turn it on, or I might bump it or something and turn it off, so I just wish that was on all the time. And the other issue is sometimes I have a spotty connection through my heavy smoker lids, and I find I have to have the base or the booster quite close to the lid so it can pick up a connection from the probe, similar to the connection issues that I have with the meter. Also, when I did my high heat test over a gas burner, the MeatStick initially would not move up in ambient temperature, even though it was way too hot to even touch it, so I knew it was much higher in temperature than it was actually reading. A few minutes later, it suddenly corrected itself and started working again, and I got 46 seconds of burn time before the temperature alert came on, which is really good, but this wasn't the first time that I experienced some type of glitchiness or delays with the app, so that kind of has me concerned. Overall, the MeatStick 4X has very accurate internal sensors, and the ambient sensors are accurate in really stable temperature environments, but as soon as you get any type of fluctuations, like in an offset smoker, then it's going to give you some inaccurate results. It doesn't have built-in Wi-Fi, but you can upgrade to get a Wi-Fi product that gives you Wi-Fi connection, and you might not need it because of all the probes I tested, this had the best Bluetooth range, an astounding Bluetooth range actually. I also like how intuitive the app is to use. The predictive cooking works great, and it accounts for carryover cooking, and it allows for data export, which a lot of other probes don't do. The only thing stopping me from really loving this probe are the ambient sensor issues, the fact that I need to press this little button to turn the booster on. That is slightly annoying. It does have some connection issues from the probe to the booster sometimes when there's a heavy smoker lid in the way, and I wish that Wi-Fi was just a built-in feature and you didn't have to pay extra for it. Honestly, I think if they included Wi-Fi and made the ambient sensor more accurate, this would be one of the best probes on the market. But as it stands right now, on the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the MeatStick a Tim Hortons coffee because it gets the job done, but there's better stuff out there. The Meter Plus, the OG of wireless probe thermometers. I've been using this probe for a really long time. I'm really fond of it. It's technically been outdated with the Meter 2 Plus, but this is a really solid wireless probe thermometer. Not without its issues though. A big issue being wireless range and connectivity. In my open air test, the Meter Plus got 350 feet of wireless range, which is in the bottom third of all the probes I tested. Not good for a probe that relies solely on Bluetooth to make a connection to your phone, but I should say that it does give you the ability through Meter Cloud to hook up a second device if you have an extra phone or tablet laying around, and that will give you a Wi-Fi connection. So it's a little bit inconvenient, but it's a good option to have. If you don't use the extra device to get a Wi-Fi connection, you're probably gonna have some connection issues because the Meter Plus doesn't have the greatest range of all the probes I tested from the probe booster to your phone, and it also doesn't have very good range from the actual probe to the booster. So if your probe is separated by something like an oven door or a smoker lid and it's not extremely close between that barrier, then you'll probably get some dropped connections. In my obstacle test, the signal could really only reach me on the couch 35 feet away from my backyard smoker, and that was a lot worse than other probes did. So if you're using the Meter Plus, I'd highly recommend connecting it to a second device and getting Wi-Fi via Meter Cloud, and also having the booster as close as possible to the the probe so that you can get a stable connection from the probe to the booster. The internal temperature reading of the Meter Plus was very accurate in all of my tests, no issues there, and the ambient accuracy was bang on in my sous vide warmer, which is an extremely stable temperature environment. In an offset smoker where most wireless probes really struggle with ambient sensor accuracy, the Meter Plus actually does a really good job. It fell in second place on average 10 degrees off from the true ambient temperature, which is really good compared to the other wireless probes that I tested. Meter customer support is actually really good. I inquired about the ambient sensor issues I was having and they got back to me the very next day. They said the ambient inaccuracy I'm experiencing is because of hot and cold spots in my smoker, temperature variance even a few inches away from the probe, dome thermometers reading temperatures at different areas of the smoker, all standard gaslighting responses that I've received from other probe brands, but I didn't get any responses that included the real issue, which is there's insulation around the probe thermometer tip, there is heat piping, if you're having temperature fluctuations, that's going to affect the reading. It was all kind of, no, this is your fault, this is because of something you're doing. And they ended by saying this: ultimately the purpose of our ambient sensor isn't to read the overall average temperature of your cooker, but to generate a cook time that gives you the best results. As long as your food is cooked correctly when the app tells you it's ready, the ambient sensor is working like it's meant to. The predictive cooking was pretty accurate in my test. I cooked a steak for 28 minutes to 130 degrees, and the Meter Plus was only 3 minutes off on average with its predictions and only 2 minutes off during the last 10 minutes. It also accounts for carryover cooking, and it told me to remove the probe from the meat a couple minutes early, but it still resulted in about 3 degrees of carryover cooking, but still, it's better than not warning me until the meat literally hit 130. It probably would have carried over a lot more. I like the Meter app a lot. It has a really nice, really clean interface that tells you the internal and ambient temperatures right up front. It's easy to set up a cook. I always choose the custom option and then set my desired temperature to the maximum it will go because I usually don't care about predictive cooking. And it's easy to switch to graph view to see how your temperatures are trending. This helps me really figure out when the temperatures are going lower in my offset smoker, so I know I need to go outside and throw another split of wood on the fire. You can also look up your cook graphs for previous cooks, which is super helpful, but I found that sometimes they don't save in rare circumstances, which is really frustrating to me because I need those graphs for my experiments. Overall, the Meter app is great. I think it's the gold standard of all of the apps that I've used. I give it really top marks. I just really wish they would add data export. That's a feature that Meter could really use to improve their product. Another positive point about the Meter Plus is it's really built like a tank. It'll last forever. There's one I have that's been going strong for over 3 years of constant use, cooking briskets, long cooks, leaving it outside in -40, and then heating it up again, just using and abusing it over and over again, and it still keeps going. It can grill steaks just fine over high heat, but I have gotten some overheat warnings in the past if it's grilling too long or the heat is too high. The new Meter 2 Plus does a much better job at that if you're really interested in using a wireless probe for grilling. I don't really use it that much because I use an instant read thermometer for that, but if it's important to you to have your meter stuck in your steak while you're grilling, the Meter 2 Plus would probably be the way to go. Another good point is it was currently on sale for 80 bucks at the time that I looked at it, and I think there's gonna be even more sales because this has been kind of superseded by the Meter 2 Plus, so I don't know if they'll discontinue this, but they probably got a lot of stock out there that they're trying to get rid of. And as a result, I think you'll be able to pick up a Meter Plus for a really inexpensive price. A negative point I would mention is that the probe thickness is quite a lot thicker than a lot of other probes out there, but the Meter 2 Plus is a lot thinner if that is something that's important to you. Another note on the Meter Plus block, which is another product that Meter carries, it comes with a standalone display and 4 probes, and it also has built-in Wi-Fi. However, all of these probes are still Meter Plus probes, so they suffer from the same ambient temperature accuracy issues, connection issues, and just anecdotally after using this for a while, it seems like I always have at least one probe that is always disconnected for some inexplicable reason. So if you want a Meter Plus, I would just go with the single Meter Plus and buy 2 or 3 of them if you need more probes. I don't think you'll get a ton more value out of the block. Unless you need 4 probes for some reason, then by buying the block, it's probably a little bit cheaper than buying just 4 Meter Pluses. Overall, the Meter Plus is a great wireless probe for the price, which at the time I looked at it, it was only $80. It has some connection issues, which you can get around by using a second device to get a Wi-Fi connection. It's not great at ambient temperature accuracy in something like an offset smoker with any degree of temperature swings, but that being said, it did rank second place in the ambient sensor accuracy test that I did. The app is exceptional, customer support is great, it's built like a tank, and this thing has kept going for years for me, and it's available for a very low price right now, so it's a really good probe. Not the best, but it's a good probe. So on the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the Meter Plus a rating rating of Ryan Gosling, and the reason for that will become apparent when I talk about the Meter 2 Plus. The Meter 2 Plus is the newest version of the Meter. In addition to what the Meter Plus can do, it's also a lot thinner, it can withstand higher grilling temperatures, you can deep fry with it, it has multiple internal temperature sensors, and Meter says it has longer Bluetooth range. I tested the Bluetooth range in open air and it had 375 feet of range, which is just slightly better than the Meter Plus. And in any event, the Bluetooth range I recorded was in the bottom third of all other probes I tested. It performed just as well as the Meter Plus in my obstacles test, which is to say pretty poorly. And if you want to get a Wi-Fi connection, it does still have the Meter Cloud, so you can connect to a second device and get Wi-Fi connectivity, which means that the Bluetooth wireless range on the Meter 2 Plus doesn't really matter that much if you're using that feature. But unfortunately, the connection issues from the probe to the booster are still there, so I still do have difficulty getting a connection from the probe to the booster if there's something like a oven door or smoker lid in between, and it has to be very close to the booster in order to get a stable connection. The internal temperature sensors were very accurate to within a degree or less in my ice bath and boiling water test and my steak cooking test, and the probe has 5 internal sensors, so it is much more likely that you're going to be able to see the lowest temperature in the center of the meat so you don't undercook it. A problem that I could see a beginner having is that they insert the probe way too far into the meat so that the probe is almost through the other side of the meat, and then if you only had one internal temperature sensor at the very tip of the probe, you would only be measuring that much higher temperature at the very edge of the piece of meat, and the actual internal temperature at the very center of the meat would be really low and undercooked, and it presents some food safety issues. So having those extra internal temperature sensors will give you the lowest reading at all times. So as a beginner, you can perfectly cook your meat and you can prevent any food safety issues. That being said, I do wonder if just having one extra internal sensor maybe halfway through the probe would do a pretty good job at that as well. And for me personally, as more of an advanced user, I'm fine with just having one internal sensor because I know where the center of the meat is and I can roughly gauge where that sensor is going to be. So it's not as much of an issue for me, and if I need to pay extra for 5 or 6 extra internal sensors, I'd rather pay less and just have one internal sensor for me personally, but I do see the value for a beginner for sure. So do you need multiple internal sensors in your probe? I think it depends. It's a nice to have, but for me, it's not a need to have. And I think with a little bit of diligence, you can get away with just having one internal sensor. Again, I've used the Meter Plus, which just has one internal sensor for years, and I never had an issue with it. So I do sometimes wonder about the value of all of the internal sensors. And sometimes with more and more wireless probes coming out, it does seem like one of those razor blade-esque type marketing things where it's like, oh yes, we have one extra internal sensor, we have 7 internal sensors, our competitor only has 6, therefore our probe is better. But does that really increase the value or the utility to the end user? Kind of questionable. But I think ultimately what I am most stirred up about really is just the ambient sensor accuracy issues of all of these wireless probes, and I really just wish that the manufacturers would fix that issue first before worrying about all of the extra features. That's kind of where I'm at right now. So let's talk about the ambient sensor accuracy, because clearly I'm pretty stirred up about it. The ambient sensor, like most wireless probes I tested in this video, is extremely accurate in stable temperature conditions. In my ice bath test, my boiling water test, and sous vide warming oven test, it was bang on to within a degree of accuracy. But in my offset smoker, it was 11 degrees off on average, making it kind of unreliable for me to use, but surprisingly still the 3rd best ambient accuracy of all 9 probes that I tested. And before you go saying, okay, Steve, 11 degrees off on average really isn't that bad, you're kind of splitting hairs here, it's important to keep in mind that that's just an average. If I throw another split of wood on my offset smoker and the temperature goes up by 20 or 30 degrees maybe before it starts mellowing out and dipping again, that happens within maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and the ambient sensor might be reading 250 degrees, but that temperature is going up and up and up, and because it's not responding instantly, the actual true temperature is more like 300 degrees. Well, this is still reading 250 degrees, but then the temperature starts slowly coming up, and then as the temperature dips, that split that I put in the firebox kind of dies down. It meets the temperature reading of the ambient sensor on the way down so that it's roughly the same, but then the actual true temperature goes down, down, down. Maybe it's back down to 250, and this guy's still at 300 and takes a while to get back down to 250, maybe a couple minutes. So the temperature reading you're getting could be as much as 40 or 50 degrees off at any given time. It's just 11 degrees off on this probe on average because of just the way that the temperature fluctuations go up and down, and because how the ambient sensor on this probe is kind of out of step with it, but sometimes aligned with it. And interestingly, in my offset smoker test, I found that the Meter 2 Plus tended to skew higher in temperature than all the other probes that I tested, which tended to skew lower in temperature. They're next to that evaporative moisture barrier, they're next to that cold meat. They should be skewing lower, but the Meter 2 Plus was skewing a bit higher. So I was like, what's going on here? Is there some sort of software adjustment that knows that it's close to the meat, so it's gonna skew low, so it automatically adjusts it higher? That's sort of like a wild conspiracy theory that I have. So I tested that by reaching out to Meter Support, and they're like, yep, that's exactly what's happening. In their response, Meter Support said, our probes are not built in the same way as most instant read thermometers, so we needed to develop a way to compensate for how long it can take the heated air of a cooking appliance to warm up the stainless steel of the ambient end of the probe. To do this, we use an algorithm that processes the temperature information that we're receiving from the sensors in the probe, then generates a close to accurate reading of the cooking environment. We've spent countless hours of testing to hone this process, but it can lead to some variation in how the ambient readings interpret the real-time conditions of the heated cooking environment. Wow, okay, that's really interesting. So the Meter 2 Plus isn't telling you the actual ambient temperature, it's telling you a temperature that the ambient sensor picked up and then ran through an algorithm, and it's giving you a reading that is as close as possible to the true ambient temperature according to the computer, which is really meta. The crazy thing is that even though it uses an algorithm to tell you the ambient temperature, it still does a really good job at it compared to other ambient probes. It was in the top 3 of ambient sensor accuracy in my tests, but it's still not really that great because all wireless probes are not really that great at ambient temperature sensor accuracy. But that being said, still really impressive that an algorithm can get that close to the true ambient temperature reading. For customer support, predictive cooking, and a review of the app, I already covered all of that in the Meter Plus review, so just refer back to that. Other good points about the Meter 2 Plus is that it can withstand really high grilling temperatures, you can deep fry with it, it's got a much thinner probe design, and it's completely waterproof. Other negative points, really the only nitpicky things are that I wish it had data export. I think all probes should have that, as I've said multiple times in this video, and I wish it had built-in Wi-Fi. Again, I just think all wireless probes should have built-in Wi-Fi. Besides that, the connection issues, the Bluetooth range, the ambient temperature accuracy issues, they're still kind of identical to the Meter Plus, and they still kind of persist in this model. So overall, I really do like the Meter 2 Plus, and I consider it to be in the top 50% of all wireless probes that I tested. All wireless probes have ambient accuracy issues when you have temperature swings in your cooking device, and this is no different, but this is one of the better ones. And it has limited Bluetooth range compared to its competitors, but you can link it up to a second device and you can get a Wi-Fi connection, which gives you unlimited range, which is awesome. It also has a ton of advanced features. It's waterproof. It has multiple internal sensors. You can deep fry with it. It can withstand very high searing and grilling temperatures. It was currently $130 when I looked up the price, which seems pretty good, but when you look at the Meter Plus, which is only $80 when I looked up the price, it has a pretty similar core feature set and pretty similar performance. So really, you're spending the extra money for the higher grilling temperatures, the ability to deep fry with it, and the multiple internal sensors. But if those things don't matter to you, then you might just want to get a Meter Plus. On the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the Meter 2 Plus a rating of Ryan Reynolds, arguably an improvement over Ryan Gosling, but they're very similar. In fact, some people think they're the same person. Both Canadian though, FYI. The ChefsTemp PROTEMP Plus is a complete package which comes with a charger booster with a built-in display. That means you don't have to look at your phone to see the temperature, but there is still an app as well if you want to look at your temperature wirelessly. It comes with one probe, and you can also buy more probes and plug them into the back of the unit. It has predictive cooking, a full-featured app, and even has a little power output that you can charge your phone with. It has Bluetooth, so you can use it without Wi-Fi, but most importantly, it has a built-in Wi-Fi connection. A very impressive offering all in one package, and I think that this is going to be the gold standard of what wireless probes need to offer going forward. Built-in Wi-Fi and a standalone display. Let's talk about connection. With Wi-Fi enabled, I got unlimited range and never had a connection issue at any time, even when I went to walk the dog or go to the grocery store. I could always see my temperatures on the app, which was super convenient. In terms of Bluetooth range, which you might use if you're away from home, like at a barbecue competition and you don't have access to the internet, it also has one of the best Bluetooth ranges with 625 feet of Bluetooth range, which meant I could connect with it anywhere in my house. It had 450 feet of open range from the probe to the booster, which means that it has a really strong signal connection, and something like a heavy oven door or heavy smoker lid isn't going to interfere with that connection, which I can attest to because when I have this plugged into a brisket, I can have my booster several feet away on a table and it still picks up a connection with the probe. In fact, I've never lost a connection between the probe and the booster, which is really impressive. For internal accuracy, the probe is 100% accurate, no issues there. For ambient accuracy, it has some issues. The ambient temperature sensor doesn't record anything lower than 122 degrees, so I couldn't do an ice bath test or boiling water test on it. I did do a sous vide warming oven test on it at 156 degrees, so it should have picked that up, but the temperature just continued to read 122 degrees, which was 34 degrees off in a super temperature stable environment, which was kind of weird. I didn't have that same issue with other probes. Additionally, the ambient sensor was off on average by about 20 degrees in my offset smoker, which was better than some of the other probes that I tested, but really in the bottom 50% of the probes that I tested and not that great. I probably wouldn't be able to rely on it in my offset smoker. And I think that's probably because there's a ton of insulation around the ambient sensor, and as a result, it doesn't respond to temperature changes very quickly. The benefit of the super thick insulation is that the probe can withstand high grilling temperatures for a really long period of time without giving an overheat warning. Unfortunately, I think that can lead to a problem in some situations as well. Because the insulation is so thick, the ambient sensor is slow to detect sharp rises in temperature and give you an overheat warning so you can pull it away from the heat. I tested a probe over an open gas flame, just like I tested all of the other probes in this video, and the temperature only got to 500 degrees, which was lower than the temperature limit, so I got no overheat warning, but the probe was actually much hotter than that, and it actually cracked and exploded because it heated up too fast and probably too unevenly. So the gas burner test that I did in this video was definitely not a good way to use the product, and I reached out to ChefsTemp support, and they said don't expose the ambient sensor to super hot temperatures, so I was probably misusing this thing and voided my warranty and all that kind of stuff. The stress test was a little bit unfair, so it's something to keep in mind. Don't use it over super high heat open flames for a long period of time, because if the ceramic heats up really quickly, it can heat unevenly and then crack or even explode. But I found in my normal grilling tests, when the probe was inserted into a piece of meat over reasonably high heat charcoal just below it, I never had any issues with overheating or cracking or exploding probes at all. So take my testing with a grain of salt. And this leads me to a question that I've thought about a lot. Should wireless probes be designed for high heat grilling at all? On the one hand, it certainly makes them more versatile. If I want to leave my wireless probe in a piece of steak and continue to flip it and monitor the internal temperature while I'm searing it, that's pretty convenient. But on the other hand, usually when I'm searing steak, I'm searing several of them, and I want to temp different areas of the steak all over to see how they're doing, and I usually use an instant read thermometer for that. I don't use wireless probes because I don't have enough of them to insert into all the steaks I'm cooking, and they don't accurately give me a temperature of everywhere in the steak that I'm cooking. It also leaves a big hole in your steak or hamburger if you're grilling with it, so that's another reason to use just an instant read thermometer for high heat grilling or searing. And lastly, using this screwdriver again as an example, when you put all that ceramic insulation over the top of the ambient sensor, it leads to all of those ambient sensor issues that I've been complaining about incessantly throughout this entire video. So I'm wondering if the juice is worth the squeeze. Is it worth designing wireless probes for high heat grilling if it means getting worse ambient temperature accuracy? In my opinion, and for the way that I personally cook, I think absolutely not. I think if they designed the ambient sensor to withstand moderately high heat, like 400 or 450 degrees, something near the maximum of what you would reasonably cook at in an oven or a smoker. And if that meant that they had to put less or no ceramic insulation around the tip of the probe so you got better ambient sensor readings, then I think it would be totally worth it. As for predictive cooking, it seemed to work pretty good on the ChefsTemp PROTEMP Plus. It was within 4 degrees of accuracy at any given time when I cooked a steak with it, so no issues there. The only negative thing I'd say is that it doesn't account for carryover cooking, unfortunately, so you do have to manually remove your meat from the heat source a little bit lower in temperature, because if you go all the way up to the set temperature before this gives you an alarm, you'll overcook your meat through carryover cooking, and this won't alert you to that. The app is pretty well designed. It gives you all the important info up front. It's slightly inconvenient to click the top right icon to access the temperature graph, and I wish that was easier to access, but overall my experience with the app was positive, and it seems clean and uncluttered. It also gives you previous cooks, but unfortunately it does not allow for data export, which again, I think should be standard on all wireless probes. Other positive points, it has that charger port on the side, which you can charge your phone with or other device, which is kind of cool because this acts as like an impromptu battery bank. It also has a bunch of different sizes of probes that you can purchase from the ChefsTemp website, and it has a standalone display, which means you can see your temperatures without having to open up the app and look at your phone. And that's even more important if you're cooking with other people or at a barbecue competition. They don't all have access to your phone, so if they want to see the temperature of the meat, you need something like this. For other negative points, other than what I've mentioned previously, it does only have one internal sensor, if that matters to you. Personally, it doesn't matter to me. Overall, the ChefsTemp PROTEMP Plus is a great wireless probe with a well-rounded offering. It has a standalone display, built-in Wi-Fi, great Bluetooth range, and accurate internal sensor, but the ambient sensor accuracy is not good compared to other wireless probes, and you might might not want to grill with it at extreme temperatures, but I did a couple steaks with it over a charcoal grill and it worked just fine, so no issues there for me personally. At $140 at the time that I looked at it, it's getting up there in price compared to some other probes, but it does have the standalone display and it does have built-in Wi-Fi, so I think that's not a bad deal. On the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving it a Vancouver Canucks because it has great performance, but it's never going to win the cup unless it makes some improvements. Moving on to the Combustion Probe Thermometer. It has 8 sensors, 4 internal and 4 external, 3 of which can pull double duty as surface temperature or internal sensors depending on how far you insert the probe, which is super cool and a feature that other probes don't have. It's Bluetooth only, but they're supposed to be making an update soon so you can use a second device to connect it to Wi-Fi, similar to what the meter can do, which is also a really good feature. Connectivity is decent. I got just under 400 feet in my open air test, and it works in most areas of my house except for the very back of my basement. It's better than both meter probes for range and connection, but the TempSpike and the MeatStick have it beat by far for Bluetooth range. So for a Bluetooth only probe, I was hoping for a little bit better, but if they get this Wi-Fi update, I think that'll make the connection a lot better. Internal accuracy is bang on, no issues there. Ambient accuracy has me a little bit flustered, to be honest. I originally bought this probe and I got it in the mail and I was really excited to use it because I've been a big fan of the CEO and the founder of this company, Chris Young, who was a co-author of Modernist Cuisine. That is one of the go-to books if you're interested in the science of cooking. And I tested it out using my Signals wired probe as a reference thermometer, and I seemed to anecdotally have really good results, and the ambient accuracy was really, really good. But then I charged the probe and I used a charger that I shouldn't have. I used the 12-volt ThermoWorks Signals charger, which basically fried this, and it's definitely not rated for that 12-volt charger, which I learned later. But luckily, customer support was really nice at Combustion, and they just gave me a new probe right away, no questions asked, which really speaks a lot about their customer service. But then when I got the new probe and I started all of the empirical testing that I did in this video and recording all the temperature data, it turned out that this had one of the worst ambient temperature accuracy ratings of all the probes that I tested. It was off by 23 degrees on average, which was worse than any other probe that I tested except for the Yumli. Now, again, like all other probes I tested, in a stable temperature environment, the ambient sensor is bang on accurate to within less than 1 degree, but as soon as I put it in a cooking device with any type of temperature swings, it's off by quite a bit. And in my offset smoker, it was off by a lot, enough that I couldn't rely on it at all for an ambient temperature reading, which has me really disappointed because I really want to like this probe. But unfortunately, I think they need to make some improvements to the ambient temperature responsiveness. Customer support at Combustion is the best of any probes that I reviewed in this video. Really top-notch customer support, really amazing. In fact, I reached out to them with a couple issues and their CEO contacted me directly with a really lengthy email explaining a bunch of stuff to me, and it was really helpful. So their customer service is amazing, and I'm really confident that if your probe has an issue at all, they're gonna replace it, no questions asked, which with a lot of other probe brands out there, they might give you a runaround and ask you to do a bunch of tests and send pictures, and maybe they won't even replace it at the end of the day. And Combustion has a much longer warranty than many of the other probes I tested in this video. I wanted to also mention that I reached out to Combustion again, giving them my methodology for how I was testing in my offset smoker and how the Combustion probe ambient sensor was a little bit off. Well, it was a lot off from what I was testing with my wired probe thermometers. And Chris Young, the CEO, got back to me and he gave me some really helpful insight. He said that he spent a lot of time in the laboratory testing both wireless probe thermometers and wired probe thermometers, and he's found that with wired probe thermometers, the wires actually pick up quite a bit of ambient heat from things like grill grates and the ambient temperature of the cooking device, and they pipe that heat into the actual probe, which results in wired probes skewing a little bit higher in temperature. And when you couple that with wireless probes skewing a bit lower in temperature because of the boundary layer of evaporating moisture surrounding the meat and the cold heat piping from the meat, you get a situation where my reference probe thermometer is skewing a bit high and the wireless probe thermometers are skewing a bit low. So his position is the wireless probe isn't inaccurate, it's just taking a different temperature than the wired probe thermometer. So I did a bit of due diligence, and to confirm this, I reached out to Kevin Owen. He's the VP of Product Development at ThermoWorks, the manufacturer of the ThermoWorks Signals that I used in my tests. And he confirmed that yes, this is a thing. Wired probes do tend to skew a little bit high in some situations because of the wires picking up ambient heat and piping it to the probe. But he says that it's only a few degrees of difference, and also ThermoWorks products do a couple things to mitigate this, like they have a thinner wire that goes into the probe. I also tested it out myself in my offset smoker. One probe was held by foil like I normally do, and one was through a potato, and the wire was also running through more potatoes to help prevent the wire from picking up ambient heat and piping it to the probe head. I did in fact find find that the regular probe that I held with foil like I normally do skewed a bit high, and the one that was through the potato skewed a little bit low. So that's evidence that this heat piping issue could exist, and I think there's an argument to be made that wired probe thermometers might actually skew high by 5 to 7 degrees. I would probably say 5 degrees as a rule of thumb, because I don't know how much of that difference was just caused by the cold heat piping from being inserted in a potato, but I did observe a difference, and I've got 2 major thermometer companies telling me that that actually is a thing. So I think it's safe to say that as a rule of thumb, a wired thermometer might skew around 5 degrees high on average. So after adjusting my reference temperatures down by 5 degrees, these were the new adjusted results. Not a huge change in terms of ranking, but there are some differences. And I'm not going to change my rankings because I don't think that 5 degrees of difference is very much, and more importantly, I think that if wired probes do in fact skew high by 5 to 7 degrees on average, then for the past couple hundred years, we've all been cooking a little bit hotter than the true thermodynamically 100% accurate ambient temperature. And I think that, especially in the barbecue community where we all are so used to using wired probes, it's kind of our reference point for our entire cooking experience. After all, we can't all go out to the store and buy a thermometer that tells us the 100% true thermodynamically correct ambient temperature in all conditions. We're using instruments with built-in biases, whether they're a wireless probe that skews a little bit low or whether they're a wired probe that skews a little bit high. I think our experience tends to be more based on a wired probe, and assuming that oven probe thermometers that are at the back of our oven and dome thermometers, stem thermometers, suffer from the same issue and they tend to skew a little bit high because they pick up ambient heat, then I think that I'm pretty comfortable using a wired probe thermometer as a reference thermometer, even if it skews 5 degrees high. Maybe that's not the best argument, but it makes sense in my head, and it's a bit of a conundrum, but my main argument still remains. I think controlling for all of these things, including that wired probe thermometers skew a little bit high, you get cold heat piping in wireless thermometers, you have the boundary layer of evaporating moisture that lowers the temperature as well. I think that the main issue that I am concerned with is related not to ambient sensor accuracy per se, it's more responsiveness over time. I feel that wired probe thermometers are much thinner, they react more speedily and quicker to temperature changes in a dynamic cooking environment, and as a result, they give us more of an accurate representation of what is happening in that cooking environment, whereas a wired probe with more insulation around the ambient probe, or just because there's more material and metal and it's bulkier, whatever the reason might be, it seems to me that wireless probe thermometers are a little bit slower to react and respond to temperature changes, and I think that is the main reason why the ambient readings on wireless probe thermometers are not meeting our expectations generally. I think that if wireless probe companies were able to increase the responsiveness so that their ambient sensors picked up temperatures quicker and they were speedier to give a result, like a wireless probe or an instant read thermometer, for example, I think that would better align with the regular consumer expectation that is largely informed by instant read thermometers and wired thermometers that give a temperature much more quickly than a wireless thermometer in my experience. The app is really well done. You can see the temperature graph and all your sensors on one screen, and if that's information overload, you can switch to a standard mode to just see one core temperature, the surface temperature, and the ambient temperature. It's all dynamic, so it has ambient sensors 1, 2, 3 right here on the probe, and then it has the main ambient sensor right here. But if you push it too far into the meat, like let's say around here, those 2 ambient sensors that the meat is covering will now turn into internal sensors, which I think is really cool. And because it's giving you the surface temperature of the meat, you can basically sous vide cook your meat in an oven. So let's say you want your entire steak to be 130 degrees Fahrenheit, you just put the set temperature on your oven to whatever set temperature corresponds to the surface temperature of your meat being exactly 130 degrees, and then over time, everything will come to equilibrium in your meat and become 130 degrees, just like when you're sous vide cooking, which opens up a lot of possibilities for cooking in unique ways with the combustion probe thermometer. The app is also built for barbecue nerds. It allows for data export, and it's built on open technology, so if you're a turbo nerd, you can actually collect temperature data from the combustion probe and feed it into another app or software. So there's a ton of possibilities with this probe, but unfortunately with the ambient sensor responsiveness issues that I get in my offset smoker, I couldn't really rely on the ambient sensor data, but maybe I could rely on the internal sensor data for some cool experiment that I would do. Other positive points is it comes with a 2-year warranty. A lot of other probes out there just come with a 1-year warranty. It has a standalone display that you can buy for extra, and this also acts as a signal booster, which is really nice to have so I can monitor my temperature without opening my phone. And also it has a much thinner probe design than a lot of other probes out there, so it's a smaller hole in your meat. Overall, the Combustion Probe Thermometer is a very promising wireless probe. I like how the 8 ambient sensors are dynamic, so if you push the probe further into the meat, the ambient sensors turn into internal sensors. And I also like how it gives you a surface temperature, which opens up a ton of different cooking possibilities. It's all open technology, so theoretically you could feed all of the real-time data into an app or some kind of software to maybe control some sort of device. And they said they're going to add a feature where you can get Wi-Fi through a secondary device, similar to what the meter does, which is really cool and means that I won't have to worry about Bluetooth range anymore. But unfortunately, as it stands right now, the Bluetooth range is pretty bad, and the ambient sensor accuracy in any type of environment where you get temperature swings, i.e. a offset smoker, it ranked last place out of all of the other wireless probes that I tested, which means I can't rely on it in my offset smoker. So on the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the Combustion Probe Thermometer a Nathan Fillion because it's lesser known but very popular amongst nerds because of Firefly, which in my opinion is one of the best sci-fi series of all time. I think he's more known for some more recent stuff, but that's where I know him from, and he's Canadian. Moving on to the Typhur Sync, this is another full package deal that comes with 2 probes, each with 5 internal sensors and 1 ambient sensor, a standalone display so you don't always have to look at your phone, a fully functional app, and best of all, it has built-in Wi-Fi. I've always used Wi-Fi with this device and I've never lost a connection, but even if I didn't have Wi-Fi available, I'd be covered by the Bluetooth range on the Typhur Sync, which is very impressive. I measured it at 450 feet in open air. That's better than both of the meters, the Combustion and the Yummly. The Typhur Sync's internal accuracy is bang on accurate, no issues there. The ambient sensor had some weirdness going on in my ice bath test. It was about 7 degrees off. But in my boiling water test, it was bang on accurate, and in my holding oven at a steady 156 degrees Fahrenheit, it was 100% accurate at 156 degrees, so no issues there either. In terms of ambient sensor accuracy in dynamic cooking environments like my offset smoker, it came in 5th place overall, being 14 degrees off the true ambient temperature on average, which is not great, and it's really the only thing that's preventing me from crowning the Typhur Sync the best probe out there on the market right now. I think if Typhur improved the ambient sensor accuracy in dynamic cooking environments, then this would be probably the #1 probe on the market. Cook time accuracy was pretty good in my test. It took a few minutes to give me a prediction, but after it did, it was only 3 minutes off on average, which is better than most probes I tested. And I want to mention again to take this test with a grain of salt. I was mainly doing it just to see if the predictive cooking worked at all. I didn't do multiple tests. I only did one. So from a scientific testing perspective, it doesn't have much value. It's just to illustrate that yes, the predictive cooking on this device works. Typhur's customer support was top notch. In general, they got back to me on the same day that I contacted them, and the help was really amazing, so no issues there at all. And the app is really nice. You just click the probe you want to see, and it has a little diagram of the probe with the temperatures of the various sensors. I really like that. And it has a graph right below it. If that's too much information for you, you can also switch to basic mode, and it just gives you your 1 internal and ambient sensor reading. It also gives you cook history, but one small issue is that if you cancel the cook early, it won't save your history, which is kind of frustrating. It also doesn't export data, unfortunately. Overall, the Typhur Sync is an amazing wireless probe. It's one of the top ones that I'd recommend because it's a full package deal. It has built-in Wi-Fi, it has 2 probes, they each have 5 internal sensors, it has a standalone display, which a lot of other probes don't have, and it's in a really nice little compact unit that you can just slip into your pocket, and it just feels hefty and good quality, similar to like an iPhone. The only real negative point I have about it is the ambient temperature accuracy is not great compared to the other probes that I tested in this video. In a dynamic temperature swinging cooking environment like the offset smoker that I used for my testing in this video. And at $229, it's not the cheapest option on the market, but it does come with 2 probes. It comes with built-in Wi-Fi, it has the standalone display, and each probe has 5 internal sensors, so when you compare it to a lot of other probes on the market, it actually does have really, really good value for money. I put a link to it in the description section below, along with any discount codes I get from Typhur, because it is one of the wireless probes that I'm recommending in this video. And if I get any updated promotions or discount codes, I'll put it in the description section as well. So on the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the Typhur Sync a Tim Hortons Timbit, because nothing really that bad to say about it. The ChefIQ, it has built-in Wi-Fi, so you'll never have an issue with connecting to it. It has 3 internal sensors and 1 ambient sensor, and it has Bluetooth as well in case you don't have access to the internet. In my open air range test, the ChefIQ had 637 feet of Bluetooth range, which is on par with the TempSpike, and second only to the MeatStick's crazy range, which no other probe competed with in my tests. So it does have really good Bluetooth connectivity if you don't have access to the internet. Also, I found it to be really reliable for the connection from the probe to the booster. I found that you could actually have the booster a little bit further away, even if your probe and booster are separated by something like a heavy oven door or a smoker lid, I still got really good connection. Internal temperature accuracy is bang on, no surprises there, and it ranked 4th place out of 9 in terms of ambient sensor accuracy in my offset smoker, off by 12 degrees on average, which is pretty good for all of the wireless probes that I've tested. The predictive cooking was extremely accurate in my tests, one of the best, if not the best. It was only 2 minutes off on average over the course of a 38-minute cook, and it gave me accurate and early predictions, which is a lot better than other probes that both took a long time to give me a prediction and then gave me inaccurate predictions. Customer support is pretty good. In general, they got back to me in 2 business days, and I learned from corresponding with them that the 3 internal sensors are actually combined and give you 1 internal sensor readout. So you can't see the individual readings of each of the 3 internal sensors. It somehow either gives you the coldest reading or it gives you a combined reading. I'm not quite sure based on what they told me. So I wish the app was more transparent about what sensor reading you're actually getting. And it would be nice if they gave you all the internal sensor readings in the app. Speaking of the app, it's pretty decent. It gives you the ambient and internal temperatures up front, and it's easy to switch to graph view. You can also set the temperature to remove the meat from the heat to account for carryover cooking, so that's kind of helpful. And it saves your cooking history, but for some reason it only saves it for 6 months. I also couldn't find a way to export data. The only other negative point I could say about this is that I was up really late at night, sitting by my offset smoker with the ChefIQ. It was around midnight, all the kids were in bed, and all of a sudden this thing comes on out of nowhere and speaks to me and says, "Your cook is nearing completion," or something similar to that. It startled me, it was weird, and as I've continued to use this, I've realized that it continues to give you those voice warnings, which luckily there's a way to disable all of them, so I don't get those voice notifications anymore. So this is more of a pet peeve, but just keep in mind, this is one of the more annoying probes when it comes to notification. Overall, this was a short review because the ChefIQ is just a great wireless probe thermometer, and I don't have a lot of bad things to say about it. It has built-in Wi-Fi, so I always have a connection. It has great Bluetooth range when there's no internet available. The ambient sensor is accurate in stable temperature environments, and it's only 12 degrees off on average in an offset smoker, which is better than some of the other probes that I tested. It does have a lower heat threshold for searing meat, but I don't really care about that because I use an instant read thermometer for that, and I think that having less insulation on the ambient sensor actually improves the ambient accuracy when there's temperature swings, so I'd actually prefer to have a probe that's better at recording ambient accuracy, even if it's worse at grilling and searing. And it was on sale for only $80 at the time I looked it up, which is insanely good value, and that's the reason that I consider the ChefIQ one of the best probes that I tested in this video. So on the Canadian rating scale, I'm giving the ChefIQ a free healthcare because it's got its issues, but it's better than the alternatives, and you can't beat the price. Getting a little bit political here. We do like our free healthcare though. So overall, what wireless probe would I recommend to my best friend? Well, for me personally, ambient sensor accuracy is so important, and I cook mainly on an offset smoker with pretty big temperature swings, and that is an environment where wireless probe thermometers tend to give slightly inaccurate ambient temperature readings. And based on my tests, none of the wireless probes that I tested in this video are good enough for me or accurate enough for me on an offset smoker for me to reasonably rely on them in my everyday cooking. So for that reason, and I hate to say it, but I would recommend a ThermoWorks Signals or other wired probe thermometer. And I'm not just plugging ThermoWorks because I'm an affiliate or anything like that. I've also used the ChefsTemp wired probe thermometer. I've used an Inkbird. I've heard a lot of good things about Fireboard. I think any type of wired thermometer that has Wi-Fi and an app on your phone and it has pretty good reviews, I think that I would prefer something like that over a wireless probe thermometer when I'm using my offset smoker. But if you use an offset smoker and you really want a wireless probe thermometer, I'd probably recommend the TempSpike, specifically the model with the thinner probe head, because in my tests, this reflected the most true ambient temperature in my offset smoker, and it was the closest to all of my wired probe thermometers. So I probably would rely on this in an offset smoker. It's close enough to the true ambient temperature that I'm comfortable using it. But unfortunately, it doesn't have Wi-Fi and some other features, so the only reason I'm really recommending it is because of the good ambient temperature accuracy. And it also seems like TempSpike has upgraded their probes so that they have a thicker probe head, and I think that that might affect the temperature accuracy. I think I'll have to test it out, but just keep in mind that my review only covers this thinner probe head. Now, if you cook in something like an oven, a Kamado, or a WSM, or even a pellet grill with less temperature swings, then I would recommend the ChefIQ. ChefIQ has a great package here. It has built-in Wi-Fi, pretty good ambient sensor accuracy. The Typhur sink, I really like the Typhur sink because it has a built-in display, the 2 probes, the built-in Wi-Fi and the 5 internal sensors in each probe, and either the Meter Plus or the Meter 2 Plus. I like these probe thermometers. I've been using the Meter Plus forever. It's built like a tank, and these give you pretty good ambient sensor accuracy readings. They ranked very high, almost near the top. So I wouldn't feel bad about recommending any of these wireless probe thermometers. Now, if I was really pressed and you really wanted me to say, like, what is the top wireless probe thermometer? I really like the ChefIQ right now. It's got decent ambient sensor accuracy, it's got built-in Wi-Fi, and it is very inexpensive. But I do often find myself using the Typhur Sync a lot more than the ChefIQ, because it's just a more compact design. It has 2 probes, and most importantly, it has the built-in display, which I really value because when I'm sitting out by my smoker, I don't want to be pulling out my phone all the time. And when I'm at barbecue competitions or cooking with other people, they don't have my phone, so they need to look at some sort of standalone display. And if you don't have that, it's kind of inconvenient. ChefIQ, Typhur Sync are kind of tied for the top place right now in my view. And then both meters, the Meter Plus and the Meter 2 Plus, really good probes. I think if they can fix their connection issues between the probe and the booster, that's kind of the most annoying issue that I have right now. If they fixed that and they added built-in Wi-Fi instead of having to use a second device, I think that would probably move the meter to the top of the list. But as it stands right now, I'd say these are probably tied for like second place. That's my hot take on wireless probes, but I think my bigger message to the wireless probe brands out there is take a look at your ambient sensor responsiveness. I'm not even gonna say accuracy. And maybe just take a look at better aligning the ambient sensor readings with what consumers expect to be the true ambient temperature. And in my view, that expectation of what is the true ambient temperature that people are used to cooking with is what would be reflected by a wired probe thermometer that is placed maybe a few inches from the piece of meat. If the ambient sensors on these wireless probes could better reflect what these type of thermometers recorded, especially in dynamic cooking environments like an offset, I think that I would be much more willing to use wireless probe thermometers on an everyday basis. And also to any of the wireless probe thermometer brands out there, if you disagree with anything that I did in this video, or you'd like me to test a newer version, or you have some suggestions on how I can improve my test or control for more variables, please let me know and I'll address it in the next comparison video that I do. I'm always happy to test the latest and greatest version, especially if it involves an improvement in the ambient sensor accuracy. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy smoking.